It's interesting because a lot of Southern food and soul food is a result of a mix of American culinary practices with African culinary practices that were brought over during the transatlantic slave trade. And so, even if you think about like hairstyles, like in the US, the braids that a lot of Black people get, they're called corn rolls, right? Rolls of corn, right? Because at that time, Black people used to hide seeds of different plants in their hair, and they used to braid it into their hair. So when they got to the new land, they could still grow foods that they were used to eating back at home.
Welcome to Cultural Collision. I'm Victoria.
I'm EJ.
Today, we want to unravel the rich tapestry of human experiences and explore the intricate connections between culture and everyday life. In today's episode, we embark on a flavorful journey as we delve into the fascinating intersection of food and culture. From traditional recipes passed down through generations to modern culinary trends. Join us as we uncover how food reflects societal values, preserves history, and shape collective identity. So how do you feel about culinary traditions? It varies across different cultures. And what role do they play in defining cultural identity for you?
That is a great question. For me, I feel like I live in the Midwest. I'm from the Midwest, but my family has roots in the American South. And so a lot of our food culture and like food identity is centered around both American Southern culture and soul food and American Midwest food. And so typically what that meant was that when we did holidays, we never had them with just our immediate family. It was always a bunch of people coming together. It was potluck style. So everyone was responsible for bringing one dish. We would get really excited about who was cooking which dish. Maybe it was my favorite dish. That was always really important. And it was just really big to signal family and community and how strong community was. It was also a really big time for older people in the family, the older generations, to pass down stories. And so it was a lot of storytelling that happened. And that was always my favorite part about, having big meals with family, was all of the storytelling and the oral history that would get passed down. And because my family has roots in the South, particularly in like the Southern Baptist Church, there was a lot of faith and religion that was involved in it. And so it was a mix of not just food, but it was religion, it was family history. And I feel like it was really good about preserving, even though we don't live in the South anymore, I almost never go to the South. I don't know any of my relatives in the South, but we still feel connected through our food culture. And that has always made me, really excited and feel special. What about you? How do you feel food and culinary traditions have shaped, cultural identity for you?
Actually, what you just mentioned about for holidays, everyone bring a dish to celebrate together, which I remember like a couple years ago when we had celebrate the Thanksgiving together and we ask people, right, to bring his or her own dish to the company and we share together. I was very surprised. Like for Chinese people, it feels like something very new. Because
Mm.
when we celebrate festivals, we normally gather together and we have the female or have the host to make all cook all the dishes. Rest of us just like wait there and wait for to eat. But I also do feel that's a very nice tradition to do when celebrating. It feels like everybody is contributing to this dinner or this meal, and that's what's very nice. Yeah. For me, actually, I think I have very mixed food experiences because I was born and raised in Beijing, the northern part of China. The habit there was every like people eat very salty things, a heavy taste. Like you can see the pickles everywhere. There's a very famous brand called Liu Biju. It's famous just for pickles. You can find like pickled Chinese cabbage, pickled cucumber, pickled all kinds of vegetables. But the thing is, the common thing is it's very salty, right? And also northern people like noodles, like balls, and like dumplings, and like mantou, the bun. But I grew up in a family, my grandparents are from southern area. So they usually cook very fresh vegetables, fish and meat. I remember when I was young, like my grandma will buy the live chicken and she will cut the chicken, she will cut the fish, she will do that by herself. So I have all the taste of different food. It's very fresh. And when we try to buy vegetables, it's very interesting things compared to the northern people. Is we only buy maybe one Chinese cabbage. You
Mm.
cannot see that in northeast area of China because people don't do that. People buy a lot, a bunch of things because also I think the weather and it is very cold and try to storage a lot of food. So I think the food can reflect people like very differently. And for me, I have like really mixed experience and mixed. So I think I also like from food perspective, from like when I grow up, I feel like I have a big tolerance on all different kinds of food. So after talking about the cultural identity for food, what the role they play. Can you share some examples of iconic dishes that symbolize the cultural heritage of specific region or countries? For example, what's your favorite food? Like you like Western or Chinese?
My favorite food is definitely Indian curry. I've always loved Indian curry as a kid. I think it's partially because growing up, my best friends in like middle school and high school were Indian. That really influenced me. I was definitely influenced by them. I was also involved in this organization in high school called Asian Awareness with a lot of the other Asian American students. And so we would do food sales to raise money for charitable causes. And so through those events, I got to taste a bunch of food from India, from China, from Nepal, from the Philippines, from Korea. I got to sample a bunch of different foods. And so I would say Asian food at large is probably my favorite, but most specifically, I will always have a special place in my heart for Indian curry. I also really like pork belly, like hong shao rou and like stuff like that. It's just so good and so many different ways that you can prepare it. So for me, Indian food is definitely at the top of my list for favorite foods. What about you?
For because I have tried very, very good Indian food in Singapore. But also sounds weird. You should visit India as well. But like in Singapore, you can taste all kinds of different like foods because we have also a lot of immigrants from Southeast Asia. So we have all different kinds of food. It's very nice. And for the past week, the reason like you bring Indian food is like that for the past week, I have the in the company we have the global kickoff. A lot of colleagues are actually from India. So we tried every single meal. We have like one, two to three dishes are from India. They were very good. But like I also surprised by how Indian people love their food and they have to eat every single meal. That's what's really interesting. For me, I think I had this discussed with a friend before. So, what's if you're gonna die very soon, what's your last dish you want to eat? Then my answer is Peking duck. I don't know why. Probably because I was like born and raised in Beijing. So I really love that. It's more like so homesick you will miss the taste. And when I was at home, I eat every single month. Well, that's it's very like more than I should eat because it's quite oily. It's quite heavy as well. Yeah, for anything else, I like 炸酱面, the noodles, but like it's only like I said, I have a very mixed culture of like northern and southern. So I like the 炸酱 only made by my dad because it's supposed to be very salty. For if you eat in a traditional like Beijing restaurant for 炸酱面, it's very salty. But actually,
Mm.
I love the flavor is a bit like sweet like more than salty. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, I Peking duck is also one of my favorite meals. I miss that a lot. And jjajangmyeon, I haven't had that in so long, but I've always preferred homemade jjajangmyeon over restaurant jjajangmyeon as well. For the same reason, it can get very salty. Um, I I feel like, those are iconic dishes that come from Beijing. I feel like for me in the US, there are, from my family, two iconic dishes that everyone knows really well. One is greens and one is macaroni and cheese, which I feel like aren't as common dishes eaten necessarily around the world, but they're like staples in soul food cooking. And oftentimes they're like side dishes, right? Greens are side dishes, it's a green vegetable that's made with vinegar and sometimes meat. Macaroni and cheese is pasta that's made with the cheese and the sauce, and it's baked mostly a lot of times in soul food cooking. But even though they're side dishes, people actually respect them and like them more than the main dish most times. So a lot of times it's like more important than the meat, it's more important than the dessert, it's more important than the appetizers and all of that. So at holidays when we would have the potluck style, people were always nervous about who was assigned to make the macaroni and cheese and the greens because if they didn't make them good, everyone would be so upset. So that was always my favorite thing. I always loved my grandmother's greens, my mom's macaroni and cheese. It's always my favorite. You talk about getting homesick and like, what do you want to eat? Like, ugh, these are the two things that I wish I knew how to cook for myself. I need to learn. But my mom and grandmother make the best greens and macaroni and cheese.
Oh God, speaking of like home cooking dish, I can't stop like thinking of all the dishes my grandma used to make. She's very good at cooking. Like she's 90 already, but she's in her 80s. She still cooks very good. All the dishes you can find in the restaurant, she can cook ba bao. Yeah, I don't know if you ever eat of that. It's duck. But duck, you take all the intestine out and you put like rice and you put like all different kind of rice into the stomach and you cook it. It's very nice. And also like the fish head soup on the traditional, the iconic Shanghainese dish. She's wow, it's amazing. But like that kind of like cooking level is gone from my family because neither my auntie and or my dad has that kind of like cooking like level. So oh, I miss that a lot.
Yeah, it's so interesting how sometimes the cooking skill doesn't continue in families. That's something that I get nervous about. My sister loves to cook and I love to cook. And so my grandmother is also like in her late 80s, I think. She might even be close to 90. And she still likes to cook, but she doesn't cook as much as she used to. And I want to go and like record and document and like make a short video of her cooking like a whole meal so I can learn and preserve that rich family history. It's so amazing. So, how do you feel that societal values and beliefs influence food preferences and dietary habits within communities?
I think it's very interesting. Like in China, I think the cultural emphasis on like not wasting food is deeply rooted in our upbringing. You can see from Asian poetry to the modern day slogans, the message of the cherishing food is always there. And it's very interesting. Like I inherit that very much because when I have like when I have lunch, when I have meal with my friends, I always something what I say is like eat whatever in your plate. Please finish it. Don't waste any rice. Right? It's like is don't waste food. I think also because China, a lot of people in poverty, they don't have food to eat. So like you know like how easy people just waste food. They cannot finish. This just go into the trash bin, and it's such a waste. So Singapore is quite different because Singapore is a developed country. So what Singapore do is the government really initiate and advocate for mindful consumption, particularly in reducing sugar and fat intake. You can see this is evidence in the labeling of the beverage with nutri-grade classifications. So when you go to the supermarket or go to any mall and to try to buy something for to drink, and it normally have something called like ABCD is nutri-grade, or it have a pyramid and it shows like it will tell you this drink have less in sugar. So they are very emphasis on this, like health. So try to intake less sugar and fat. That's what I observed in Singapore. So how's that in the US?
The US is interesting because I think the US gives contradictory messages when it comes around food. The American standard diet isn't very healthy, right? It's not the best diet in the world in terms of nutrients, right? There's a lot of meat, there's a lot of cheese, there's a lot of sugar intake in the US. So the US has to sort of counteract that, has a really big emphasis on diet culture and body image, which I think can be challenging because of lifestyle conveniences in the US due to, past historical events like wars and things like that, which led to the increase in production of like processed foods like spam, canned goods, things like that that can be preserved for a really long time, but aren't, like you said, they're not fresh ingredients that maybe your grandmother would have gotten from the market. These are all things that sit on the shelves for a really long time. It's super convenient and it's easy to eat and it's easy to make a lot of different foods in the US, but they're not necessarily the most healthy. And so diet culture is there to sort of correct that, but diet culture can be really, really, really hard on people. And it ends up resulting in body image issues and things like that because people don't know how to really understand the mixed messaging that you get, especially currently in the world of social media, where people like to post a lot of their food and there's a lot of food porn and things like that, and like influencers that try to get people to spend a lot of time thinking about food. I think in the US, people spend an absorbent amount of time thinking about food, looking at food online, sort of fantasizing about food. So social media has been helpful in that it has helped globalize and democratize access to food. I think in the US, a lot of my peers and I, because of this, we have very like broad palettes. You can find a lot of different foods in the US and people get really excited about it, but it's not always done, I think, in the best way and the most authentic way. And so I think the social values around food in the US are interesting because it's not really super standardized. But I think that from my own personal experiences, because my family, so part of the reason why my family moved from the southern US to the Midwest was during the Great Migration was to look for better opportunities because financially and politically and socially, things weren't great for African Americans in the South. And so they moved to the Midwest for better opportunities. But because of that, my dad, grew up very poor. And so he used to say the same things to us, always eat all of your food, clear your plate. We weren't allowed to be picky eaters. We had to eat whatever was given to us. We didn't really have a ton of choice. And so nowadays I can appreciate that because it forced me to eat a bunch of different foods growing up. And so I appreciate that. But as an adult, I still like I will eat things and that I don't really want to eat because I'm in my mind, I'm like, you have to eat it all. You have to clear your entire plate, which is a funny thing to tell yourself even when your parents aren't there, because I know I don't have to finish my plate, but I always feel like a little guilty around that. So I've experienced some of that as well.
I also have the same feeling if I can't finish my food. And also like I grew up as not like very picky about the food. I just don't have the maybe we have something we really don't like it, but we normally don't cook at home. But like when we eat at home is what you eat outside. When something you just get into your plate, you try to finish all, even though you might not very like it, but just you just feel, oh, I cannot waste this. This is not good. We
Hmm.
always have this like thinking, but that's good thinking though.
Yes, I think so as well.
So, in what ways does the history of a culture influence its culinary traditions and the ingredients used in traditional dishes?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, my family being from the South, there's a lot of Southern tradition that is brought to the food that we cook. So, it's interesting because a lot of Southern food and soul food is a result of a mix of American culinary practices with African culinary practices that were brought over during the transatlantic slave trade. And so, even if you think about like hairstyles, like in the US, the braids that a lot of Black people get, they're called corn rolls, right? Rolls of corn, right? Because at that time, Black people used to hide seeds of different plants in their hair, and they used to braid it into their hair. So when they got to the new land, they could still grow foods that they were used to eating back at home. And a lot of that was like a ton of vegetarian cooking. Even if you think back in Africa now, they eat a lot of beans, they eat a lot of vegetables, things like okra, black eyed peas, watermelon, right? Those are all foods that were brought over from Africa to the the US. And now in my family, right, of course, I love watermelon, which is funny because it's a stereotype, right? In the US that Black people love watermelon. But I don't think people realize that it's because watermelon originated in Africa. So it's just a native fruit that people were used to eating. Because of that, I feel like there's a lot of like fusion that happens when those worlds collide, right? There's a lot of fusion. So for us, yes, we are from the South, but because I live in the Midwest, we sort of do it a little bit differently based off of how things are in the Midwest. I think it's very similar if you look at places like LA, where there's a huge Asian and Latin and Hispanic populations that exist there, right? There's fusion around that. That's how you get places like, if you remember Palms, LA, it was Korean Mexican fusion, right? That's, popular in areas like that. Or even in New Orleans, where I spent time over Christmas, there's tons of fusion there from Black, French, Spanish, Creole, flavors that are there, and it creates these really interesting, distinct pockets of food and cultural tradition. So I think that's really exciting. And the US is such a big country that, depending on where you are in the country, each region is going to have its own sort of cultural history. And, if you're by the water, there's going to be more seafood, like in Maine and Boston, versus here in the Midwest, we have a lot of cows. So there's a lot of cheese and there's a lot of dairy around that, which, you don't get in a lot of other places. So it's always exciting for me to see those regional and cultural differences and how it shows up in food.
Yeah, I totally can feel that. So you're talking about the fusion, right? I also can feel like this things is also how like different landscape inflect our food. The fusion for me in Beijing, I feel there's a lot of fusion from like Western plus Chinese. Maybe like Middle East food with Chinese. So in China, we have like 8 different type of like the cooking style, and then they can be mixed and developed to different dishes and with different flavors. In in Hong Kong, I think it also is as a Hong Kong's cuisine merits its status as a global hub, blending with the Cantonese flavors with the influences from the British colonial rules and neighboring the regions. And then in Singapore, it's very interesting as well, because Singapore's multicultural society has resulted in a vibrant food scene where you can see a lot of Malay, Chinese, Indian, Persian influences carried in the melting pots of flavors and ingredients. Like I mentioned, like you can find all different flavors. They have very like good Indian food in Singapore and very famous Peranakan like Malay dishes in Singapore and also like Thai food or like even Vietnamese. There's a street where like my company located on is called Vietnamese Street. So if all the Vietnam sandwich, the pho, and all the different dishes, you can tell, and it's not so traditional. It's originally from Vietnam, but it combined with like the flavor how Singaporean people love. So it's changed a little bit, and it's a little bit different, but it just for to better suit the local people's like flavors.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's so cool how I think about like Xi'an as a perfect example of like natural sort of Chinese fusion of like the Muslim culture, Chinese culture coming together and like making these really cool, authentic dishes. I love seeing that happen organically. And Singapore, yes, you said being that multicultural nation. Singapore is like one of my at the top of my list of places I want to go to eat because I feel like it has all of my favorite foods in one place.
Well, you definitely can taste a lot like different foods here. I feel, but for the Chinese food here, I don't want to say like it here is better than China, probably not. But like the other Southeast Asia, like Asian food, you definitely can try a lot just in one country.
How do you think that rituals and customs surrounding food preparation and consumption contribute to the cultural significance of meals?
I can think like good things are bad things. In Chinese culture is sometimes we need to wait for everyone to be seated at the table before starting a meal. So for for me to have lunch with my colleague, even in Singapore, it's a Chinese culture, and they're like very heavy Chinese culture. We'll wait everybody to be ready, or like the meal will be served in front of you. Then we have 4 of us. Then everyone have a dish. Then we start to eating. And in China is like in the family is similar, right? Like everybody sit on the table. Sometimes we wait for the grandma, the elderly people to sit on the table, start to eat first, and then the rest of us will follow. And some traditions I also know is in this happens in northern and southern. It does have like it's quite a kind of by the way of tradition is where the male members with the same family name start eating first and followed by women and those married into the family, which is like what we call 外姓人, not with the family name here. And this is a sign of the respect and hierarchy within the family structure during the festival gatherings. This has happened in what I heard this happened in Northeast and also happens in South in Taiwan as well. So sometimes you cannot eat together with them on the first table, or like even you eat the food they left over after they finish. That's something like is also under Chinese culture for like how we do like how we eat together and especially like celebrate the festival because you're gonna have a huge family. Yeah.
Mm. That's interesting. I've heard about that concept of the male members eating first and then everyone following. I feel like my Chinese professor told me like that's the original meaning of the word wrong.
Not sure about that.
I think that's what he said. I don't know if that's true or not, but he said that that was like the original meaning of wrong was to yield to other people to eat first. And then the women would eat sort of last. And that, as you said, sometimes not even together. In the US, it's a bit different. I think particularly what I have noticed is that there's still the idea that everyone waits for all the food to be finished and for everyone to be ready to eat together. But typically, if there are kids around, you always let the kids eat first because kids tend to get whiny and they will complain about being hungry first, especially little kids. And so our tradition was always to feed the kids first, which when I got out of the range of being a kid when I was in high school, I was always jealous because I would wait so long to eat and I would always get jealous of the little kids who got to try the food first. But outside of that, the biggest ritual that I remember growing up with um, outside of the potluck was prayer. My family was really religious, so we would always pray and say grace before meals. And it's not something that I do anymore, although I do think that just because I'm not as religious as I was growing up, but what I like about the idea of prayer and saying grace before a meal is that it forces you to take a moment to stop and be grateful for the things that you have. So that was always the thing that I liked about it the most. It was being grateful for the food, being grateful for the time together with family, being grateful that, we have the ability to cook for ourselves and to nourish ourselves. And so it's something that as an adult, I've thought about reincorporating into my life again, like saying grace, not necessarily for the religious aspect of it, but for the gratitude aspect of it. I actually think that it's a really good way to practice gratitude. So, and then in more formal settings, like for really important holidays, there was always really, really important to set the table in a really specific way. And there's all the table etiquette around it. And I never went to etiquette school, but my parents always taught us there's a specific spoon that you're supposed to eat the soup with, which is a different spoon that you would use to eat dessert with, or there's a certain knife that you use to cut meat with, and there's a different knife that you use to spread butter with. And so those are all things that like as a little kid I didn't really know. It wasn't as important, but as I've gotten older, I've learned how to navigate those in more formal fine dining situations.
I love the pre part before like having a meal is just like you said is very grateful because the all the food provided to us is not like what we call in China is not like fallen from the sky. It's not 从天上掉下来的, right?
Mhm.
There's people fighting for it. There's people working hard to buy food and cook for us is with love, right? It's supposed to be like be very grateful for your eat meal. That was my very nice gesture. And also the tradition, like you mentioned about like, especially for important festivals to decorate. I think that's very important as well, is you cherish this moment, cherish this festival together with your family and make it special. Oh, I love all this like the good traditions you have in the US that like I think more and more Chinese people are trying to do that before like we're having a dinner or before like we celebrate the festival.
Mm.
So I talk about like globalization and fusion, right? How do you feel that impacted culinary landscapes around the world, and what are the implications for preserving traditional food practices?
It's a really good question because I think in the US, because the US is, a multicultural nation, there are people from all over. So we typically have access to foods from all over, even in smaller cities and small towns, right? You can still find food from different places. Um, I think the challenge that happens in the US is that there's this concept of cultural appropriation where people from, let's say, for example, if I were to open a Chinese restaurant, right? And I started making, Chinese food, and maybe I made it and it was really good, and I came up with these new dishes. It feels a little inappropriate in the sense that like I'm not Chinese, right? Especially if I'm not giving credit to where credit is due. I think that in the US, there's a lot of tension around sort of people creating ethnic restaurants or creating new restaurants ideas, but not being a part of the culture, not including people from the original culture into the process, and not working with those communities in order to uplift them. And so I think that because of that, I do my best to support local and traditional restaurants as much as I can if I have access to them. Obviously businesses are businesses and they're going to run, the way they are, and it's fair to have competition, but it certainly makes me value more, as you said, people are fighting for opportunities. And especially in the US, a lot of immigrants who come to the US, depending on their situation, they do get involved in food business or service businesses. And so I definitely like to support them when I can, as opposed to going to sort of big chains or big places that might not really be connected to the culture anymore. I think that social media has played a big part in this. It allows people to be curious about new foods, which I think is really important because if you get curious about new foods, it opens a door for you to learn more about people and their cultures. I think food is a great gateway into learning about people and their culture. So I'm very grateful to be, in the city that I am. It's pretty international because of the university that's here. There's a lot of international students that's here. There's a lot of international restaurants here. And so because of that, I've learned a lot about different people and their cultures as a result, just through eating. So that has been exciting. So definitely try to support local and, traditional mom and pops places when I can. What about you?
Yeah, I think like we talk about fusion, the rise of fusion food, where the traditions from different cultures blend together and create innovative dishes. For instance, like Chinese Western fusion cuisines have gained popularity, offering like different combinations to cater to evolving tastes and preferences. I think the other side of this is as this spreads, there's a risk of overshadowing the authentic culinary traditions and flavor more commercially vibe and universal appealing options. So when people really love fusion, and then how about the traditional food, right? How to preserve the traditional food? Like you said, it's like rooting for the local food for the local restaurants by run by the local people, and that's kind of like very very important. Otherwise, like the young people, if they didn't try the traditional one, they'd only know the fusion part, and they think "Eh, this is like the new fashion. I want to follow this. I have to try different new things. Then the traditional part gone. But I think in for Beijing, as far as I know, it preserved very well. Where like in China, because you always want to try what the local people actually have, what local people actually eat. Sometimes the flavor is not like so acceptable, but still is something like for generations people try to eat and to keep this while the fusion cuisine celebrates diversity and creativity, it also is essential to strike a balance between innovation and the preservation of the culture heritage.
Yeah, I think about preserving traditional dishes as much. I mean, I mentioned before how I want to spend time with my grandmother so I can learn the dishes because I want to be able to pass that down to my nieces and nephews, or if I end up having kids myself, I want them to be able to make soul food and I want them to know the stories behind all of the food as well. I think, you know, there's so much more to a dish than just does it taste good? Is it salty enough, right? Or is it spicy enough? There's so much more behind the dish. So this is definitely inspiring me to have some conversations and to write some recipes down.
Yeah, it's always good to preserve what our traditions are. You're right. It's not about like the flavor. Maybe we cannot copy the 100% and make the same dish and make very delicious, but like is important to keep, or sometimes it's for us to when we have the homesick, when we miss this dish by our grandma or like even their grandmas, then we can cook and this help us like emotionally feels good and to preserve to teach our kids, our next generations is another kind of like keep the tradition.
Okay, and that wraps up our delectable exploration of food and culture. From the vibrant spices of India to the comforting flavors of Italian cuisine, we've uncovered the diverse ways in which food serves as a gateway to understanding the world around us. We hope this episode has ignited your appetite for cultural discovery and inspired you to savor the rich tapestry of culinary traditions that enrich our lives.
As we bid farewell, we invite you to share your favorite culture dishes and culinary experiences with us. Leave a comment, join the conversation on social media, and let us know how food has shaped your culture identity and brought communities together. Until next time, keep exploring, keep savoring, and keep celebrating the delicious of diversity of our world.
Bye.
Bye.